What would you do if someone tried to take what was rightfully yours simply because they thought they were more important? On a seemingly ordinary flight, one woman's calm defiance turned an act of entitlement into a lesson no one on board would ever forget. Stay tuned. This is a story of quiet power, shocking twists, and ultimate karma. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the air as Naomi Richards settled into her plush first-class seat. She exhaled deeply, savoring a moment of peace after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings. Her window seat offered a perfect view of the airport tarmac, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was a moment she had earned, a small luxury she allowed herself after years of relentless hard work. Naomi's life hadn't always been this way. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, her parents instilling in her a fierce determination to rise above the limitations society often imposed. As the founder and CEO of a thriving tech company, Naomi now stood as a symbol of resilience and success. This flight was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, a trip to finalize a major international partnership that could propel her business to unprecedented heights. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and reached for her leather briefcase. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the cabin, mingling with the faint aroma of designer perfumes worn by her fellow passengers. A steward passed by, offering a warm smile as he handed her a glass of sparkling water. Naomi accepted it with a nod, savoring the crisp bubbles against her lips. Everything felt perfect, but perfection, as Naomi would soon learn, could be fleeting. A commotion at the front of the cabin snapped her out of her thoughts. Naomi glanced up, her gaze locking onto a tall blonde woman entering the first-class section. The woman's posture screamed entitlement, her designer handbag dangling from her elbow as if it were a badge of honor. Behind her trailed a slightly shorter companion, their whispered conversation just loud enough for Naomi to catch snippets of it. "Can you believe this airline? This seat assignment is ridiculous," the blonde muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Her companion, a brunette with a nervous laugh, replied, "I know, Madison, but maybe it's just a mistake. They'll fix it." Naomi felt a prickle of unease as the two women stopped beside her row. Madison's sharp gaze flicked to Naomi, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her handbag. Naomi returned her attention to the briefcase on her lap, unwilling to engage. She had dealt with people like Madison before, people who saw her skin color before her accomplishments, who assumed her place in the world was up for negotiation. "Excuse me," Madison said, her tone clipped. Naomi looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yes? I believe there's been a mistake," Madison said, gesturing toward Naomi's seat. "This is obviously meant for someone else." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "This is my seat, 1A. I reserved it weeks ago." Madison's lips curled into a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You see, I'm a gold tier member with this airline. I always get priority seating. You might be more comfortable elsewhere." Naomi stared at her for a moment, letting the weight of the woman's audacity sink in. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you." Madison's smile vanished. Her companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to avoid further conflict. Before Madison could respond, a flight attendant appeared, his crisp uniform adding an air of authority. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his gaze darting between the two women. "Yes, there is," Madison said, her voice taking on a dramatic lilt. "This seat, my seat, has been mistakenly assigned to someone else. I need it resolved immediately." The attendant glanced at Naomi, who offered a calm but pointed response. "There's no mistake. This is my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it." The attendant hesitated, caught between Madison's assertiveness and Naomi's quiet confidence. "Let me check your ticket again, ma'am," he said to Naomi, his tone polite but faintly skeptical. Naomi handed over her boarding pass without a word, her heart steady despite the growing tension. She had been here before. In boardrooms, on stages, in countless subtle confrontations where she had to prove she belonged. This was just another test. The attendant examined the ticket and nodded. "This is indeed your seat, Ms. Richards." Madison's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, her polished veneer cracked. That can't be right. She must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they? Naomi bit back a sharp retort. Instead, she fixed Madison with a steady gaze. "I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over." Madison's companion tugged at her arm, whispering something inaudible, but Madison wasn't ready to let it go. "I'm not sure you understand who I am," she said, her voice low but seething. "I always fly first class. I'm not about to let someone like—" "Madison," her friend hissed, cutting her off. The flight attendant cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you have any further concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor." Madison glared at him, her frustration barely contained. Finally, with a huff, she stormed toward the front of the cabin, dragging her reluctant companion behind her. The flight attendant gave Naomi an apologetic look before retreating to handle other duties. Naomi watched them go, her expression unreadable. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity heavy in the air. It wasn't the first time she had been singled out in such a way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But Naomi wasn't about to let anyone diminish her. Not today. Not ever. Leaning back in her seat, she took a sip of her water and closed her eyes. This was far from over, and deep down, she knew it. Naomi leaned back in her seat, flipping through the pages of a sleek, leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. Her meticulous handwriting filled the pages, notes, strategies, and ideas for the deal she was set to close overseas. As she adjusted her reading glasses, a faint commotion caught her attention near the entrance of the first-class cabin. The door had just opened to allow the remaining passengers to board. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with platinum blonde hair swept into the cabin, flanked by another woman carrying an oversized designer tote. The first woman moved with an air of entitlement, her head tilted high as if the world existed solely to cater to her needs. She paused in the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the rows like a hawk searching for prey. Naomi caught the subtle narrowing of the woman's eyes as they landed on her. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered that look, a mix of curiosity and judgment, laced with the unspoken question. "What are you doing here?" "Excuse me," the woman said sharply, waving at a passing flight attendant. Her voice was cultured, but carried a distinct edge of impatience. "This must be a mistake. My seat is supposed to be here." The flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed hair and a slightly nervous demeanor, smiled politely. "What seat number, ma'am?" "1A, of course." "I always book 1A, she replied, her tone dismissive. She gestured vaguely toward Naomi, her manicured finger pointed like an accusation. "But clearly, there's been a mix-up." Naomi's heart sank. She knew where this was going before it even began. The flight attendant checked his tablet and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but 1A is correctly assigned. Ms. Richards booked it in advance." The woman's jaw tightened. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a loyal customer of this airline. A very loyal customer. Surely there's some accommodation you can make." The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "We can try to arrange something, but—" "There's nothing to arrange," Naomi interrupted, her voice calm but firm. She looked up, meeting the woman's gaze squarely. "This is my seat, and I intend to keep it." The woman blinked as if startled that Naomi had spoken. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat. Perhaps in business class." Naomi's expression didn't waver. She had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with people who underestimated her, and this moment was no different. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," she said evenly. The air around them seemed to shift, the quiet tension of the first-class cabin turning sharp. Other passengers pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their tablets and books. But Naomi felt their curiosity, their silent judgment, like a weight pressing on her. "Let me handle this," the flight attendant said quickly, trying to de-escalate the situation. He turned to Naomi, his voice polite but carrying an undertone that grated on her nerves. "Ms. Richards, would you mind moving to another seat? Perhaps 2C? It's still in first class, and it would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Davenport." So that was her name. Madison Davenport. The kind of name that came with country clubs and generational wealth, Naomi thought. Naomi leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. "I booked this seat for a reason," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I won't be moving." Madison's face darkened. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Naomi to hear. She turned to the flight attendant. "Do you even know who I am? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I don't think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers." The attendant swallowed, glancing between Madison and Naomi. His hesitation said everything. He knew Madison had connections, and yet he also knew Naomi was within her rights. But in this unspoken power dynamic, Naomi could already feel where his loyalty lay. "I'll get the supervisor," he said at last, retreating down the aisle. Madison turned back to Naomi, her lips curling into a forced smile. "You could have avoided all this, you know," she said, her tone saccharine and insincere. "But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise." Naomi tilted her head, studying the woman before her. "Compromise?" she repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Interesting choice of words." Madison's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but the arrival of the flight supervisor cut her off. A middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and an air of authority approached, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, glancing between Naomi and Madison. Before anyone could respond, Madison jumped in. "Yes, there's a problem. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow she ended up here." The supervisor's gaze landed on Naomi, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Ms. Richards," she began cautiously, keeping her tone neutral, "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class and—" "No." Naomi's tone was firm but devoid of anger. She didn't even look up from her phone, where she was still typing out a message. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flickered to Madison, who was now pacing in a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Madison's face was a mix of indignation and impatience, as though she couldn't fathom why this conversation was taking so long. "Deborah," Madison interjected, her voice dripping with entitlement, "I don't understand why this is even a discussion." "She's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member. You know what that means, don't you? I've spent more on this airline than she probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy glances, though none of them dared to intervene. Naomi finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Madison's with startling intensity. "Mrs. Davenport," Naomi said slowly, her voice smooth but laced with steel, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Madison's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. "This isn't about the money," she snapped. "It's about respect. People like you." She stopped short, as if realizing she had ventured into dangerous territory. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the flight supervisor, Deborah, seemed to shrink under Naomi's gaze. Madison hesitated, floundering for words. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her confidence faltering. "I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class and I—" Naomi held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop." Her voice was firm, steady. "You've said enough." The authority in her tone made Madison recoil, but the woman quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. "Fine," Madison said, turning back to Deborah. "Are you going to let her get away with this?" Deborah felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to prioritize customer satisfaction above all else. But this wasn't an ordinary dispute. She could see that Naomi wasn't just another passenger to be placated or dismissed. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that warned Deborah against pushing too far. "I'm afraid Ms. Richards has the right to remain in her seat," Deborah said at last, her voice carefully measured. "She booked it, and we cannot force her to move." Madison's face twisted in fury. "Unbelievable!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline? I'll be speaking to corporate about this. Mark my words." Naomi smiled faintly, though her eyes remained steely. "Let's." She reached for her phone and began typing a message, her calm demeanor never wavering as the tension around her grew thicker. She had dealt with people like Madison before, and she knew exactly how to handle them. Deborah Lane shifted uncomfortably on her polished black heels, the weight of the escalating tension pressing down on her. As a seasoned airline professional, Deborah had dealt with her share of difficult passengers. But something about this situation felt different. She could sense that Madison Davenport wasn't just another disgruntled traveler. She was the kind of customer who believed she deserved preferential treatment simply because she existed. Deborah turned her attention to Naomi, who remained seated with an air of calm authority. There was something unshakable about her, a quiet power that seemed to command the space without her needing to raise her voice. Deborah hesitated. "Ms. Richards," she began cautiously, keeping her tone neutral, "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class and—" "No." Naomi didn't even look up from her phone. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Deborah's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flickered to Madison, who was now pacing a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Madison's face was a mix of indignation and impatience, as though she couldn't fathom why this conversation was taking so long. "Deborah," Madison interjected, her voice dripping with entitlement, "I don't understand why this is even a discussion. She's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member. You know what that means, don't you? I've spent more on this airline than she probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy glances, though none of them dared to intervene. Naomi finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Madison's with startling intensity. "Mrs. Davenport," Naomi said slowly, her voice smooth but laced with steel, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Madison's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. "This isn't about the money," she snapped. "It's about respect. People like you." She stopped short, as if realizing she had ventured into dangerous territory. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Even Deborah, who had been trying to keep the situation under control, seemed to realize that Madison had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Madison hesitated, scrambling to recover. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Then what did you mean?" Madison's mouth opened, but no words came out, because they both knew exactly what she had meant. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Deborah looked between the two women, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see the moment Madison realized she had lost. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. "Mrs. Davenport," she said evenly, "I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself further." Madison clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "This isn't over," she wanted to say, but deep down, she knew it already was. She turned sharply, storming down the aisle toward her assigned seat, her face burning with humiliation. The first-class cabin remained silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone. Deborah let out a quiet breath, her eyes flickering back to Naomi. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out, but she had one. And Deborah suspected that the repercussions of this moment weren't over yet. Not by a long shot. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the flight supervisor, Deborah, seemed to shrink under Naomi's gaze. Madison hesitated, floundering for words. I didn't mean it like that, she stammered, her confidence faltering. I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class and Naomi held up a hand, cutting her off. Stop, she said firmly. You've said enough. The authority in her voice made Madison recoil. But the woman quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. Fine, Madison said, turning back to Deborah. Are you going to let her get away with this? Deborah felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to prioritize customer satisfaction above all else. But this wasn't an ordinary dispute. She could see that Naomi wasn't just another passenger to be placated or dismissed. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that warned Deborah against pushing too far. I'm afraid Ms. Richards has the right to remain in her seat, Deborah said at last, her voice carefully measured. She booked it, and we cannot force her to move. Madison's face twisted in fury. Unbelievable, she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline? I'll be speaking to corporate about this. Mark my words. You do that, Naomi said coolly, returning her attention to her phone. But Madison wasn't done. She turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath about entitled people and incompetent staff. Deborah let out a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. A few moments later, Madison returned, flanked by the flight attendant, Greg, who looked both confused and alarmed. Madison had clearly decided that reinforcements were necessary to bolster her case. She refuses to cooperate, Madison announced loudly, gesturing toward Naomi as though she were a misbehaving child. I demand that you do something about this. Greg looked at Naomi, then back at Madison, his expression torn. He turned to Deborah, silently asking for guidance. Before Deborah could respond, Naomi stood up. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, and the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Naomi's movements were deliberate and precise as she reached for her phone and pressed a button. The faint sound of a ringtone filled the air. I didn't want to do this, Naomi said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She glanced at Greg and Deborah, her eyes cold and calculating. But since you've decided to escalate, I'll escalate too. She turned her back to Madison and spoke into the phone. Yes, it's Naomi Richards, she said, her tone professional but edged with irritation. I'm currently on one of your flights, and I'm having an issue with the staff. A pause. No, I'm not looking for compensation. I'm looking for accountability. The color drained from Deborah's face. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping in front of him. Madison frowned, clearly confused by the sudden turn of events. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. I'll expect a response before we take off. And if I don't get one, I'll assume this is a systemic issue and take it to the board. She paused, letting the words sink in. Thank you. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Turning to Deborah, she smiled faintly. Now, she said, her voice dripping with quiet authority, let's see how corporate handles this. Deborah swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling fully on her shoulders. She didn't know who Naomi Richards was exactly. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a battle she wanted to lose. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath in the moments following Naomi's decisive phone call. The hum of the engines was the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence. Naomi returned to her seat, her expression calm, though her eyes carried a quiet fire. She picked up her leather notebook once again, flipping it open with deliberate care, as if the conversation had already been resolved in her favor. Deborah Lane remained standing near the aisle, her usually confident posture faltering. The weight of Naomi's last words, "Take it to the board," echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Naomi Richards' tone and composure told Deborah that this was no ordinary customer. Her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully, but the presence of Madison Davenport loomed large, demanding a resolution. Madison, however, was not a woman accustomed to waiting or losing. She crossed her arms tightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her sleeve in frustration. The faint smirk she had worn earlier had faded, replaced by a deep scowl. "Well?" Madison finally broke the silence, addressing Deborah with an imperious tone. "Are you just going to stand there and let this nonsense continue?" Deborah hesitated, glancing at Greg, who stood behind Madison, his posture stiff with discomfort. She knew she was walking a fine line. Choosing Madison meant risking Naomi's wrath, potentially damaging the airline's reputation if this woman truly had connections at the board level. But siding with Naomi would mean incurring the ire of a Platinum Elite member, someone the airline valued as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Davenport," Deborah began cautiously, "I assure you, we are handling the situation. Please take your seat for now, and I will follow up shortly." Madison's eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring. "Take my seat," she repeated incredulously. "Take my seat? I'm supposed to be in her seat." She jabbed a finger in Naomi's direction, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "Do you have any idea who I am?" It was a phrase Naomi had heard countless times before. She didn't even bother looking up from her notebook, flipping a page as if Madison's tantrum was no more significant than the faint rustle of paper. Her nonchalance only seemed to fuel Madison's anger further. "I demand to speak to the captain," Madison said sharply. "This is completely unacceptable. If you won't fix this, I'll take it up with someone who will." At the mention of the captain, Deborah's composure cracked, just slightly. Calling the captain into a passenger dispute was a last resort, an escalation that could disrupt the entire flight and delay departure. It wasn't a decision to be made lightly. She stepped forward, lowering her voice in an attempt to calm Madison. "Mrs. Davenport," she said firmly, "please understand that the captain's primary concern is the safety of the flight. This matter does not warrant his involvement. Let's resolve it here." But Madison was having none of it. "Oh, I see how it is," she snapped. "You're protecting her because you think she's more important than me. Well, let me tell you something. If I'm not in that seat by the time this plane takes off, your airline will be hearing from my lawyers." Naomi sighed softly, finally closing her notebook with a quiet thud. She placed it on her lap and looked up, her eyes meeting Madison's with an expression that was equal parts calm and unyielding. "Mrs. Davenport," Naomi said evenly, "if you truly believe your lawyers can resolve this, by all means proceed. But before you do," she continued, leaning forward slightly, "I suggest you consider the consequences of escalating a situation you're clearly not prepared to handle." Madison blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet authority in Naomi's voice. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice faltering for the first time. Naomi sat back, crossing her legs with deliberate ease. "It means," she replied smoothly, "that throwing your weight around might work in some circles, but it won't work here. Not with me. And certainly not with the board members who will be reviewing this incident." She paused, her gaze steady. "So I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself further." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Deborah looked between the two women, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see Madison's face turning red, her jaw working furiously as she tried to formulate a response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Ladies," a deep, authoritative voice said from behind them. The captain himself had appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin, his uniform crisp, his demeanor composed. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even Madison fell silent. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene with practiced neutrality. Deborah stepped forward quickly, hoping to defuse the situation before it spiraled further. "Captain, we're handling a minor seating issue," she said. "There's no need for your involvement." "I'll be the judge of that," the captain interrupted, his tone firm but calm. He turned to Madison, who immediately launched into a tirade about her Platinum Elite status, her loyalty to the airline, and the injustice of being denied her rightful seat. The captain listened patiently, his expression giving nothing away. When Madison finally finished, he turned to Naomi. His eyes softened slightly. "And you, ma'am," he asked, "do you have anything to add?" Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "No, Captain," she said simply. "I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it. If the airline made a mistake with Mrs. Davenport's reservation, that's unfortunate. But it's not my responsibility to fix." The captain nodded, his eyes lingering on Naomi for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned back to Madison. "Mrs. Davenport," he said firmly, "I understand your frustration, but this seat was properly assigned to Ms. Richards. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight." Madison stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water.
"But—"
"That's final," the captain said, cutting her off. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." The cabin erupted in a collective intake of breath. Madison looked around, her eyes wild, searching for someone, anyone, to take her side. But there was no sympathy to be found. Naomi, meanwhile, picked up her notebook and opened it once again, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't need to say anything more. The situation was already unraveling exactly as she'd expected. Madison clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at Naomi as if she were the source of all her problems. But Naomi didn't even look up. And for Madison, that was perhaps the greatest insult of all. Madison's furious footsteps echoed down the aisle as she begrudgingly retreated to her assigned seat. The cabin, thick with tension, fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. The captain gave a small nod to Deborah, signaling that the matter was settled, for now, before returning to the cockpit. Deborah exhaled quietly, trying to regain her composure. She could feel the weight of the situation lingering in the air, heavier than the crisp collar of her uniform. Madison might have been pacified temporarily, but the look in her eyes promised retribution. And then there was Naomi, silent, composed, but undeniably powerful. Deborah couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Naomi flipped open her notebook again, her fingers tracing the edges of the leather cover as if grounding herself. Her calm exterior was a practiced art, but beneath it, she felt the faint stirrings of frustration. This wasn't the first time she had encountered such treatment, and though she rarely let it get under her skin, today felt different. Perhaps it was Madison's overt entitlement, or the complicit hesitation of the crew, but something in her had shifted. Her phone buzzed softly in the pocket of her blazer. She pulled it out with a quick, fluid motion. The screen lit up with a notification. "Incoming call, Marcus, Corporate Affairs." She smiled faintly. Marcus was efficient, sharp, and fiercely loyal, a trusted ally on the airline's corporate board. If anyone could address this situation swiftly, it was him. She pressed the phone to her ear, keeping her voice low to maintain discretion. "Marcus," she said, her tone steady but carrying an undertone of annoyance. "I need you to handle something." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke. His voice was calm, professional. "I saw your message. What's going on?" Naomi glanced around the cabin, ensuring her conversation remained private. "I'm on flight 827 to Zurich," she said. "The crew just tried to pressure me into giving up my seat for another passenger. A Platinum Elite member who thinks the world revolves around her." Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible. "They what?" "You're kidding." "I wish I were," Naomi replied. "It wasn't just a request, Marcus. It was a thinly veiled attempt to prioritize her over me because, in their eyes, she's more valuable. When I refused, it escalated. They called the supervisor, who asked me again, as though I hadn't already made myself clear." Marcus's tone darkened. "This is unacceptable. Do you have names?" "I do," Naomi said. "The flight attendant, Greg. The supervisor, Deborah Lane. And of course, our dear Mrs. Davenport." "Consider it handled," Marcus said firmly. "I'll escalate this to the CEO myself. They'll be lucky to keep their jobs by the time you land." Naomi paused, her grip on the phone tightening. "Don't stop at firing them," she said quietly. "I want a systemic review. This isn't just about me. It's about how many others have been treated like this. I'm tired of these exceptions becoming the norm." Marcus's voice softened, his respect for her evident. Understood. I'll start the process immediately. In the meantime, is there anything else you need? Naomi hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. The fiery hues of the sunset had faded into a soft twilight. The runway lights glimmered faintly against the deepening sky. No, she said at last. Handle the rest from here. She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. For a moment, she allowed herself a deep breath, letting the familiar rhythm of her heartbeat steady her nerves. The storm wasn't over, but she had set things in motion. Now, all she had to do was wait. Across the aisle, Deborah watched Naomi out of the corner of her eye, her unease growing by the second. The quiet confidence with which Naomi had conducted herself wasn't just intimidating, it was unsettling. Deborah had dealt with plenty of demanding passengers in her career, but none had carried the quiet authority that Naomi exuded. Something about her demeanor suggested that she wasn't just another first-class traveler. Deborah glanced toward the galley, where Greg was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed tightly. His usual air of casual confidence had all but disappeared, replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his tie. Deborah decided to confront him. "Greg," she said, stepping into the narrow space. "We need to talk." He straightened, his expression defensive. "About what?" "This situation," Deborah said, lowering her voice. "I don't think you realize who we're dealing with." Greg scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "She's just another passenger who thinks she's above everyone else," he muttered. "I don't see what the big deal is." Deborah frowned, her voice sharp. "She's not just another passenger, Greg. She knows someone high up. Did you see how she handled this? She didn't even raise her voice, but she's already called someone outside the chain of command. I think we've made a mistake." Greg shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Deborah's words settling over him. "You think she's connected?" he asked, his confidence faltering. "I think we need to be careful," Deborah replied. "And I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that this might come back on us." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an update from corporate headquarters and will be making a brief delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and will provide additional details shortly." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Deborah's stomach dropped. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing. Corporate was already involved. She turned to Greg, her expression grim. "This isn't over," she said softly. Greg said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time, he realized they had underestimated Naomi Richards, and that mistake could cost them everything. The hum of the engines had quieted, replaced by the faint rustling of passengers settling into their seats. Their conversations were muted as the announcement of the unexpected delay sank in. Naomi closed her notebook again, resting her hands on the leather cover. Her calm demeanor remained intact, though the sharpness in her eyes hinted at the mental chess game she was already winning. She glanced out the window. The glow of the terminal lights reflected faintly on the glass. This pause, she knew, wasn't just a coincidence. Marcus worked quickly, and if he was already pulling strings, things were about to unfold in ways no one here expected. 15 minutes later, the stillness of the cabin was broken by the soft hiss of the cabin door opening. Two sharply dressed men in suits stepped inside. Their presence immediately drew attention. One carried a sleek briefcase. The other held a tablet in one hand, his expression unreadable. Naomi's gaze flicked toward them. The faintest hint of a smile played at her lips. Marcus never disappointed. The taller of the two men scanned the cabin briefly before his eyes landed on Deborah, who had stepped forward instinctively at their arrival. "Ms. Lane?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Deborah nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, I'm Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor. Can I help you?" "We're with corporate," the man said, holding up an ID badge. "We need to speak with you and the rest of your team. Immediately." Greg, who had been lingering nearby, froze mid-step. His face paled as he exchanged a glance with Deborah, who looked equally unsettled. "Is there a problem?" Deborah asked, though she already knew the answer. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the galley. "We'll speak privately. Now." Deborah and Greg exchanged another look before following the men into the galley, their movements stiff and uncertain. As the door to the cabin closed behind them, a ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. Even Madison sat straighter, craning her neck to see what was happening. Naomi, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. Her hands rested lightly on her notebook. She didn't need to see what was happening in the galley. She already knew how this story would end. The gears were in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Inside the galley, the air was thick with tension. The two corporate representatives stood with practiced composure, their eyes sharp and assessing as they addressed Deborah and Greg. "We've reviewed the situation," the taller man began, his voice even but cold. "And we've spoken with key stakeholders regarding this flight." He paused. "Effective immediately, both of you are being removed from duty." Deborah's eyes widened in shock. "Removed? But there's no room for negotiation," the man cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your conduct has been deemed unprofessional and inconsistent with the airline's policies. Further disciplinary action will be determined following a full investigation." Greg's mouth opened and closed, his usual arrogance replaced by sheer panic. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't do anything wrong." The second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "We've reviewed passenger testimony and corporate records," he said firmly. "Your actions jeopardize the integrity of this flight and the airline's reputation. This decision is final." Deborah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her years of service, her carefully built career, gone in an instant. Greg, meanwhile, had gone pale, his hands trembling as he tried to form a coherent response. "You're to leave the aircraft immediately," the first man said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Security is waiting outside to escort you." As the two stunned crew members were led out of the galley, Naomi turned her head slightly, watching them from the corner of her eye. The faintest trace of satisfaction flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it. Returning her attention to her notebook, Madison's indignant voice rose again, but this time, it barely registered. Naomi had already won the battle, and she knew. The war was over too. The cabin door closed with a final, resolute hiss. The passengers who had been murmuring quietly fell silent once more. Their gazes shifted toward the first-class cabin, where Naomi sat. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged, though her presence now carried a weight that no one could ignore. The plane finally began its taxi to the runway. The hum of the engines returned as the tension dissipated entirely. Naomi gazed out the window. The soft glow of the city lights below cast a faint reflection on the glass. She had fought this battle not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. And today, she had won. Karma, she thought, had a way of working itself out.